overview of the talk, right? First, I'll say a little bit about Sellars on method of the given. Don't want to say too much about this because if I start saying too much, I'll just spend the entire time talking about that. I'd rather not, but feel free to pose further questions about that in the Q&A. I then want to introduce this idea that Sellars introduces at the end of his text, Empiricism and Philosophy of Mind, where he introduces the idea of the myth of Jones as a replacement for the myth of the given. I want to say a bit more about what I think Sellars has in mind by that. And then sort of from that framework, say Sellars has a problem. He needs to tell us some story about how the myth of the given could even arise in the first place. Right, so at the end of the story, right, we've transcended the myth of the given, we've gone beyond it, but now I say, well, how did we get here? What even led to that happening? At that point, I want to say, this is where we might find something useful in the Marxist philosopher Alfred Sondatel, in particular the way he argues for the urges that something really important happened in human history when intellectual and manual labor became separated. And so on that basis, I then want to say it's the separation of intellectual and manual labor that explains the origins of the myth of the given and explains why that myth had to be invented in the first place. So, what's the myth of the given? So here in a late text, the lever of Archimedes, Sellars says the most basic form of what I have castigated as the myth of the given, this will show how good I am, because I actually do it from memory, can be summarized as, okay, try it.
Sorry.
Okay.
Again.
Can be summarized as the following principle. Oh dear, not again, right? Okay. If a person is directly aware of an item which has categorical status C, the person is aware of it as having categorical status C, right? So if an item to have categorical status is if an item to be classified or classifiable within a conceptual framework, and the given, Sellars wants to say, arises when the myth of the given is the idea that someone could know which category an item belongs to simply by being aware of it, right? Do items, as we experience them, as it were, wear their categories on their faces? That is the most basic form of the myth of the given. This is what Jim O'Shea calls the myth of the categorical given, the belief that there is some kind of permanent, unchanging stratum or dimension to our discourse, such that it would have this sort of permanent, unrealizable structure no matter how the rest of our discourse might change as a result of science, technology, other kinds of revolutions, and so on. So, quick example of what the myth of the given amounts to, right? Take, for example, a very dumb, sort of, kind of dumb examples that philosophers love, seeing a red brick. To see a red brick is to see a physical item, the brick, which is red. But is color a property of physical objects? Sellars actually wants to say, remarkably enough, no. Because in a manifest image, yes, it is, but in the scientific image, it isn't. Because in the scientific image, Sellars wants to claim, physical objects are composed of microparticles. Microparticles don't have colors. So Sellars wants to use this kind of example to then think about how, as science can pose challenges to our manifest image framework of the world, and give us reasons for thinking, oh wait, we used to think colors are properties of physical objects. Now we realize that actually colors are properties of sensory consciousness, not of physical objects. So sort of where you put the category, the concept of color, where that gets classified, as goes from state of physical property, physical object, to gets reclassified as state of sensory consciousness, So the history of science gives us reasons for radically revising how we categorize things like colors, as well as sounds and shapes and other things. Now, that's not a particularly great example. I don't want to endorse Sellars' view on colors. I think it's kind of silly, to be honest. But I do want to use this as an example of Sellars' larger thesis that science has its own categorical framework that we can use to question, challenge, revise aspects of the categories of our manifest image descriptive metaphysics. Okay. And as a result of that possibility, that kind of challenge, right, it just can't be the case that we are just entitled to say, oh, well, in everyday life, things have this kind of categorical structure, and so therefore, they really do have the categorical structure that we experience them as having, right? To think that would be, on Sellars' view, the myth of the given, that you can just experience things in a certain way, and then that tells you right away, just by that experience, how to correctly classify them or categorize them. Now, in Sellars' text, Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind, he ends with this kind of fable or story. He calls the myth of Jones. So in the myth of the given is a text about how we should think about the conceptual framework of mental states, such as thoughts and sensations. Do we just sort of, and so in the text, Sellars says, well, we could sort of imagine, right, this fictional imaginary person, Jones, he calls him, because 20th century, everybody was Smith and Jones in philosophy. And so Jones, in Sellars' sort of fable, sort of discovers that people have these hidden mental states, thoughts and sensations. And he sort of figures that, oh, we can explain some regularities and irregularities in behavior if we posit thoughts and sensations. And then he sort of teaches other people how to use that conceptual framework. So this is then the last paragraph of this essay, in which Sellars says, I've used a myth to kill a myth. I've used the myth of Jones to kill the myth of the given. But he says, is my myth really a myth? Or does the reader not recognize Jones as man, with a capital M, himself, in the middle of his journey from the grunts and groans of the cave to the subtle and polydimensional discourse of the drawing room, the laboratory, the study, the language of Henry and William James? Right. Now, of course, notice he puts in Henry James there, right? He's sort of interested in the fact that we can actually, we've learned how to tell really interesting works of literature, psychologically deep works of literature, in our journey beyond the grunts and groans of the cave. And of course, the philosophers who, in their efforts to break out of discourse to an arche beyond discourse, are provided the most curious dimension of all. And I want to take this fairly seriously, or see how far we can get by taking it seriously, right? What displaces the myth of the given, if we sort of read the myth of Jones as, oh, there's something interesting going on here, then what I take this to be saying is, what displaces the myth of the given is a historical understanding, where we understand ourselves in historical terms as being on part of a historical journey, like the natural history of animal cognition on this planet, in which rational cognition and science are themselves chapters of that larger story. And those stories have an origin, the grunts and groans of the cave, so, whatever the origins of language in, 500 to 300,000 years ago, all the way through the various conceptual transformations that have led to the very discourse that we're engaging in right now in this room. So myth of the given is thus the idea that we could somehow break out of all discourse, break out of all of these cognitive constraints, and just directly apprehend the world as it is, right? An arche beyond all discourse that could give a kind of transcendent ground or basis to all possible knowledge. And the idea of there being such an arche is sort of on Sellars' bold conjecture, precisely what unifies as different philosophers as Descartes and Hume and Kant and even Hegel. I'm not going to engage with what Sellars says about Hegel, but it's worth mentioning. Like there's this, he does sort of say at the very beginning of EPM that not even Hegel, the great foe of immediacy, was entirely free of the myth of the given. So this raises then this question: where does the myth of the given even come from, right? At what point in the journey from the grunts and groans of the cave to the polydimensional discourse of William Henry James, at what point in that journey does the myth of the given even arise, right? We have to sort of, and my question here is, what kinds of resources could Sellars have available, or what resources would Sellars need to have available in order to answer that question about where myth of the given even comes from in the first place, right? Under what real historical conditions did the need for an arche beyond all discourse even arise? And we need this to fully overcome the myth. So this is where I'm going to now turn to Son-Rattel. And Son-Rattel's critique of epistemology. I'm going to move kind of quickly here because I'm mindful of not overrunning time. The main thing that I want to focus on in Son-Rattel, this is from his, is the idea of a separation of intellectual and manual labor. And Son-Rattel is giving a kind of interesting critique of epistemology because theory of knowledge has itself been, in a way, like the discourse of intellectual laborers amongst themselves in a kind of self-enclosed fashion, completely disconnected from real-world conditions. Right. We don't need the fallacies of idealism are best overcome by just not even talking about theory of knowledge and actually talking about intellectual and manual labor instead. Okay. Now, two questions. One is Son-Rattel's question: was the basis of this divide between intellectual and manual labor? And there's also then, together with a Sellarsian question, how does this divide give rise to the search for the arche beyond all discourse? So here's a nice long quote from Son-Rattel about how on his version, on his story, intellectual labor and manual labor can become separated at the very basis, the very origin of class divisions within societies, right? So at one point, under sort of primitive communism, to use a Marxian term, right, everyone engaged in both intellectual and manual labor, but then as surpluses get built up, and there's also a story here about the origins of civilization in the Neolithic, that as surpluses get built up, you can arise the possibility of a whole group of people whose sole job it is not to do anything, but to tell other people what to do. So you have the rise of a divide between those who command and those who obey. And Son-Rattel thinks that the origin of Greek geometry is sort of really interesting here for thinking about how intellectual labor becomes separated off from manual labor. Because Greek geometry, Son-Rattel contends, was very different from Egyptian or Indian geometry, right? Because whereas Egyptian and Indian geometers actually had physical pieces of rope that they would lay on the ground and use to measure areas and to measure lines and angles. Whereas the Greeks didn't do that. The Greeks just drew lines in the sand on, I guess maybe, not really paper, I guess lines in sand, right? And they're just measuring things that's disconnected, right? They're constructing theorems, they're constructing proofs, but for Greek geometry, it's not directly connected to the physical act of measuring the earth, geometry, right? Instead of doing that, they're doing something very different. So for the Greeks, geometry then becomes this model of intellectual labor that has become separated off and cut off from manual labor, to the point where people who are doing Greek geometry don't even recognize the continuity in what they're doing and Egyptian geometry. They see it as a different kind of activity. They come to understand intellectual labor as not having anything to do with manual labor. It's a different kind of thing. It's a different kind of knowledge. It's better, it's higher, superior kind of knowledge. And so this origin of Greek geometry is part of the story I want to tell, building on the tell, about how intellectual labor falls into a mystification of itself. It forgets its own nature because it forgets that at one point it had deep continuity and connections with manual labor. It comes to think of itself as a different kind of enterprise entirely. And yet there's a need for what I want to call cognitive friction. So this is a term that I'm borrowing from John McDowell. John McDowell in Mind and World talks about the frictionless spinning in a void that you get with certain kinds of coherentism. And so I'm using that frictionless spinning metaphor to say we need what I'm calling cognitive friction. We need some kind of assurance that our thoughts are somehow could be in contact with or bring us into orientation with a world that we discover and don't merely create. We need cognitive friction. Okay, but then the question arises, okay, once you're in a position of intellectual labor, right, where you have been cut off from manual labor, you no longer recognize that what you're doing is anything, and you no longer think of discourse as having anything in common with that, you know, sensor motor activity that the slaves and women are doing, animals, right? Something better, something different. It's got to be. So how then, from that position, would the demand for cognitive friction then become satisfied? Well, intellectual labor is exemplified by discourse, right? Talking is what intellectuals do. Right, we all know that. It's okay, we can admit it. We're among friends here. This is a safe space. We make a living by talking. And so intellectual labor being exemplified by discourse, when it tries to satisfy the demand for cognitive friction, has no other resource it can call upon except discourse, because that's all it's got, basically. But to serve the function of cognitive friction, the kind of discourse that's called for must be special. It must be weird. It must be different from all other kinds of discourse. Because if it didn't do that, so it has to be the special function of a discourse that also serves as the arche beyond discourse. Right, so what we're calling for here is the intellectual class trying to think of how can we imagine or construct a kind of way of talking where the talking by itself justifies the assurance that we are in touch with the world that we discover and do not merely create. The only reliable criterion that we actually have such a mysterious kind of discourse is a discourse that was immune to all possible revision. Because if it were open to possible revision, it couldn't serve this kind of founding, legitimizing, stabilizing role that discourse would have to have in order to satisfy the demand for cognitive friction. And so here is then the beginning of the myth of the given. Or put now, one might say, why must the given be a myth? So here I'm going to go out on many, many limbs here, quite speculatively, but I think it's somewhat justifiable. Leaning on some ideas from the enactivist tradition that you've already heard about from Andrea, and other ideas coming from existential phenomenology and other theorists in the 20th century, I think it's safe to say that the true nature of cognitive friction comes by way of the active embodiment and engagement with the world. And so you can think of Merleau-Ponty and Gibson and others as helping to, as I kind of claim. It's also a claim that I think is going to be important to many philosophers in the Marxian traditions. Okay. But from that standpoint, if you sort of think something like that cognitive friction requires active embodiment, then it becomes totally clear why the intellectual class because they are separated from material embodiment, or at least imagine that they are, right? They imagine that they are because of the separation of intellectual manual labor. And because of that separation, they're able to kind of fantasize that the demand for cognitive friction could be satisfied by something other than active embodiment and material engagement. They imagine that it could be satisfied by a special kind of discourse, a special kind of talking. And so this then puts them in the position of basically trying to effectively fantasize. It's basically a collective fantasy, right? That a special kind of discourse we could just come up with that would have the basically magical powers. I mean, and that's kind of where I think the myth of the given comes from. Like, the myth of the given is the idea that we could just sort of, we could have direct knowledge of the structure of reality just by sort of, beaming our noetic rays into the world. And, oh, that's real, that's not. That's sort of seeing it, right? I'm making fun of position, but I think I'm trying to sort of do that to lean into Sellars here. I think Sellars would maybe not want to be quite as mean-spirited as I am, unless he were, on his fourth martini. But apart from that, he would, I think, want to say, like, the myth of the given involves the idea the mind has these kinds of magical powers that don't obey the laws of cause and effect the rest of reality has to. And so the myth of the given then is a discourse that's simply a kind of discourse, a magical kind of discourse, that simply by engaging in it, that would be enough to establish that you have reached beyond old discourse to an arche, a foundation, something that can sort of provide the role of cognitive friction. And so, in this way, we arrive at this kind of fantasy of even the intellect as this kind of self-contained, hypostasized kind of faculty that, separated off from the rest of embodiment, separated off from the rest of historical reality, separated off from everything else, that the intellect is like this magical power that can just by itself see the nature of reality. Okay, so why then does Sellars need Saint Martel? Just to kind of wrap this up here, because Saint Martel, in his story about the intellectual separation of intellectual and manual labor, gives Sellars something that Sellars needs but can't give himself. And that is an explanation for the real, historical, material basis of the origins of the myth of the given. And that myth of the given arises when the demand for cognitive friction is satisfied by a kind of purely magical, fantastical kind of discourse. And that discourse is fantasized or fabricated precisely when the intellectual class, in separation from from everyone else, has to kind of fall back upon its own resources for imagining how that cognitive friction could possibly be satisfied. Sellars himself doesn't really tell this kind of story, and so I'm trying to use Saint Martel to kind of fix that particular deficiency in Sellars' own account. And so hopefully this shows that, to some extent, Sellars' own revolution of philosophy requires something like historical materialism to be further developed. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting. So McDowell makes many claims, but two of them are that the non-conceptual cannot influence the conceptual in the right way. It cannot give a reason for the conceptual. Mm-hmm. And he also says the conceptual is unbounded. It's there's nothing beyond it.
Yeah.
And you give this motivation for the myth of the given by basically saying there's this class of intellectuals, and they are basically what one would call idiots. They understand what they do. Mm-hmm. They don't understand anything beyond that. And that's the reason why they can't think of something beyond the cognitive or and so on. Mm-hmm. So the what you say about the myth of the given also sheds a very unfavorable light on McDowell, because he seems to be one of those idiots. He seems to be someone who can't imagine anything beyond the conceptual because it's unbounded, and who can't imagine anything impinging on the conceptual that is not already itself conceptual. So I think you might be turning, like, either there is no argument in McDowell, and he is an idiot in that sense, or he has an argument, and then, like, it's not merely idiocy that produces that dilemma.
Okay. I wasn't expecting, I should have expected to talk about McDowell. I would not say in public that John McDowell was an idiot. But I do think that McDowell's attempts to avoid the myth of the given are entirely misguided. And I say that because I actually do think that avoiding the myth of the given does require giving active embodiment a much more prominent role than McDowell's prepared to do. Okay.
Thank you. I like Somrithal's work, but you said you were going to tell a story, and you used the example of geometry, but then you said some very negative things about geometry. You said it's, they've forgotten where their superior kind of knowledge came from, and you talked about it being fantasy. Then you used it to go on to an argument about discourse being fabricated and fantasized. And I kind of find that very strange, because the fact you can project that on the screen is due to geometry. You know, the kind of technologies, all the developments we have. I don't think Marx would agree with you about geometry. Geometry is an amazing tool, and it is an abstraction from a concrete practice, as you described historically. But, surely Marx would think that all of the amazing artifacts and theoretical structures that we've developed are tools that we can use to express further aspects of the world, rather than it being a fantasy. So, of course, I understand, that classical economics account of how capitalism is functioning might very well fit your characterization here. But when you're talking about geometry, that move to an abstract system that could then open up a whole further, amount of aspects of nature was an incredibly important development for human beings.
Yes.
But you described it as, you kind of talked about it in condemnatory terms.
I was not attempting to give a Marxian theory of geometry.
No, but
I was attempting to use Sommertel to explain the nature of Greek geometry. But the Greeks did not, and the beginning of the idea that, let me give you a quick example of the kind of thing I have in mind, right? Remember there's a similar passage in the physics, where Aristotle says, physics and mathematics have nothing to do with each other, right? For Aristotle and for the Greeks, mathematics was not a tool for changing the world around them. That's precisely what made Galileo such a breakthrough, right? So I'm not really talking about history of science or trying to talk about history of technology, certainly not in Marxian terms. I'm trying to say that the way Sommertel talks about Greek geometry, in particular, is a model for how the intellectual class came to think of its own activity as distinct from and separate from the activity of manual laborers. That's what I'm trying to do there.
But I suppose I better leave it and go to another question. But I just want to stress that surely that development was incredibly important for humankind.
Of course, and no question. And for that matter, without the myth of the given, we wouldn't have metaphysics or epistemology or ethical theory. So the myth of the given itself has been tremendously productive for the kinds of various symbolic forms we've been constructing for millennia. At the same time, it's also something we have to go beyond. Cognitive science, I think, is showing us precisely why it's necessary to go beyond the given. So I'm not trying to say, oh, it was a terrible mistake. We never should have gone down that route. I'm not saying anything like that. I'm not trying to say anything like that, obviously. I hope that's obvious. I'm not saying, oh, that was a terrible mistake. I'm rather pointing out that I'm only trying to say, that there's a need within a Sellarsian framework to give an account of how the myth of the given was even possible to begin with as a story about the very nature of rational cognition prior to the rise of a scientific explanation of rational cognition, which the cognitive sciences have been giving us for the past 100 years or so.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for this presentation, Carl. As you know, I worked on Sellars and Zonhattel as well. My question is related to something that I find striking about the way you're presenting, which is the absence of the problem of real abstraction, which is very important for Zonhattel.
Yes.
And I fear that real abstraction is, first of all, it seems to me that real abstraction, the exchange abstraction, is part of that history of the separation between intellectual and manual labor for Zonhattel. And this is the first thesis, and I once divided this in two theses. The first one is the very existence of something like a real abstraction, which is an abstraction that begets social form in a certain sense, and this Zonhattel is located in the exchange abstraction. And the second thesis is the transmission of these abstractions, the kind of practical abstraction, to the intellect in the form of geometry, of first philosophy, of the transcendental subject, Kantian transcendental subject. So this seems to be integral to Zonhattel's account, and it's absent from your account. At the same time, one of the problems with mediating Zonhattel and Sellars is, isn't Zonhattel's story, in a certain sense, falls into the given itself? Because if real abstraction that happens outside there in social form just transmits by itself the forms of the transcendental subject, in a certain sense, it falls into the given, right? So how to parse that problem in a certain sense? I mean,
okay. Well, yes. I mean, because so your work convinced me that Somertown has a real problem here, right? That it'd be a problem if it'd be a problem if the real abstraction is somehow the forms of real abstraction become the forms of intellectual abstraction, right? As a seal on melted wax, to use that example, right? So that's why I was hoping to not talk about real abstraction, but. So the longer version of the project, and if this may be viable, but I mean, like the question. So the problem, of course, and you're quite right, JP, right? Can I use Somertel the way that I want to without talking about abstraction? Yeah. Can I get away with it? You're right, because I didn't talk about abstraction in the talk because you convinced me that's a problem. Now, if it turns out that even the separation of intellectual manual labor, even that story can I get that for free without the real abstraction story? I mean, the talk is a gamble that I could, right? But now you're calling my bluff. Okay. So good. Someone has to.
Okay. Well.
So one more. I don't think we've.
There are. I think. Yeah.
So we'll, you just. Hi. Thank you, Carl. I'm totally convinced that one needs an historical account of why the myth of the given exists in the first place. I had a question about your story, though, of our mythical proto-intellectuals. It's not clear to me why they would ever feel the need to have the friction that you're claiming they feel the need to have. Since in order to, I would assume that in order to have that need, they would already have to be playing games of justification that the friction is meant to kind of give them the ability to play in some sense. So I'm just curious about that particular move. Is why would a notional Greek pre-intellectual want to defend themselves from a McDowell argument? Would be the implausible way of putting it.
It's because I think that even Plato was very concerned to show that what he's doing is not just telling stories about the gods the way the poets do, but saying something that really gives some kind of traction with the nature of how things really are. So I think that so I mean the game of giving and asking for reasons gives us a kind of intersubjective friction with each other, sure, but that's not what I think I'm trying to talk about. I'm talking about with what kind of assurance can we have that when we have these that our thoughts are really putting in touch with how the world really is. That's what I mean by cognitive friction. And I think Plato feels that kind of pressure to say, like, I'm not just telling nice stories about the gods the way the poets do, I'm doing something else. And I think that is the beginning of this kind, and then, then the question, well, what's your model for that's going to look like? How are you going to theorize or understand what that activity is going to look like? You're not just one of the poets, you're not one of the artisans, you have this kind of superior, better kind of knowledge. What's your model for that going to be? Well, the motto of the academy was, let no one ignorant of geometry enter here. Right? Because geometry is the model, the template for this kind of superior, purely intellectual knowledge that's not contaminated with all that, sensor, motor, messiness.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more. All right, go on.
Conrad wants to ask something.
Oh, sorry. What was that a raised hand? Oh, okay. Yeah, go on, Conrad, if you want to unmute.
Okay, yeah. Thank you for your presentation. I appreciate that a lot, and I think some of what you're doing here resembles some of what I've been doing in my thesis as well, so it's quite rich for me. I guess the question I had about this, and I won't purport to be an expert in the work of Sellars, but if you're going to use the language of the myth of the given, and you have this incorporation of Sachs that you're applying, in a way, I think maybe what becomes important to ask is how are we going to square Sachs with an idea of the scientific image? Because if we're to speak of the scientific image, in contradistinction to the manifest image, then it seems as if that would presuppose real abstraction, because the scientific image, by its very nature, calls for a more analytical and sort of extra-phenomenal understanding of reality. In Sachs' work, there are some suggestions which I find quite tantalizing. But the overall tendency within intellectual manual labor, for instance, is to see the reign of the exchange abstraction as being abolished or cured, so to speak, right, by the return to the standpoint of manual labor, right? But of course, manual labor is not the scientific image. So I think there's a tension between those terms, and I just wanted to ask you how you might approach that.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a nice question, and I need to think about this a lot more. I guess I don't know how much I want to read. I don't know how much I want to read Saint Vital as, a Marxian version of the Husserl from the Crisis, where you sort of have to return to the everyday life world away from the Galilean mathematics. I don't know. There's a version of that in Saint Vital. I'm not sure how far I want to push that. What I really would want to push is that the scientific image is at best a philosophical abstraction from the activities of scientists. And scientists are engaged in scientific practices. Scientists are themselves using their bodies. They are building equipment. They are testing it. They are manipulating instruments. They are learning how to use instruments as augmentations of their own senses and bodies. That science, in a way, is a far more embodied activity than philosophy is. And if I want to tell a longer story than I've already told, I probably want to say something about how I basically want to sort of tell a story that uses something like 4E cognitive science to justify scientific realism by thinking of scientific instruments as themselves prostheses. of our senses and bodies.